I think I'll begin now. Yeah, everyone, hello, happy Sunday. Welcome to the third discussion in the Africa Oxbridge dialogue series, which will look to discuss with the statement, this house believes that Africans are indifferent to racism in the diaspora. So that'll be our discussion point. That is, this house believes that Africans are indifferent to racism in the diaspora. So the Africa Oxbridge dialogue series is a collaborative venture between African and African diaspora students at the University of Oxford and Cambridge University. So the series has convened a recorded schedule of debates and discussions on Africa-facing topics, with the recordings of these conversations aiming to be shared online to increase access and engagement, with the view to convene in-debate discussions once it is safe to do so. So I am one of your co-hosts today. I am Julian Guadagwashi Chiesa, a BA French and Spanish undergrad and a history postgraduate at Oxford, soon to be coming to Cambridge next year to continue my studies of history. And I'll pass it on to my co-host, Stephen, who's going to take you guys through to the first part of the conversation. Stephen? Hello, Stephen?
Yeah. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I sort of went up for a bit.
Okay.
So,
yeah.
Is my turn now?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I was off for about 30 seconds. So welcome everyone. We're talking about, today we're going to be talking about racism. It's the third in the series of the Oxbridge dialogues, as Julian has rightly said. And we're going to be laying a platform for discussion that is one of the four most volatile discussions that, as many will say, I mean, the four most volatile discussions in the year 2020 right now is religion, gender, sexuality, and of course, racism and race. And these four dialogues, or these four topics, have always been very volatile in any face that you look at them. Today, we're going to be picking one of them, which is race. And we're going to be talking about the perceptions of racism and the dynamics of those perceptions and the impact it has on Africans and in turn, the entire world. So racism has been with us for a long time. And I tend to start the position by looking at prejudice, the prejudice towards race. And the prejudice towards race is really complicated. And today we're going to be trying to unpack them. But what we're going to be engaging in that might not be what most of us are usually hear every time is the idea of racism, the perception of racism from the perception of from the standpoint of Africans in the diaspora and the standpoint of Africans in Africa. So what do Africans in Africa think of racism and how do they respond to it? And what do Africans in the diaspora think of racism and how do they respond to it? So if possible, we'll try to manage the simultaneous viewpoints and try to juggle these standpoints to see what we can make out of it. And we have four speakers who will be speaking on different aspects of it, probably one of it or both of them. We're not really sure until we listen to them. And basically that's the platform. That's the foundation upon which the dialogues today will actually progress. So without further ado, I will introduce to us Femi. We've all read his profile, and he will start by telling us what he thinks about the whole idea.
Femi?
Is Femi there?
Cool. Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, good.
Oh,
yeah.
Cool. So, yeah, I mean, how long should I speak for, by the way?
7.5 minutes is fine. And it can be as informal as you want. It's a dialogue.
Yeah.
It will be informal.
Yeah.
Anyone who knows me knows that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, when we talk about Africa, and we talk about the diaspora as two independent units, for me, that itself kind of starts to raise questions, because the diaspora here, right? We're here doing this Oxford Cambridge thing, and most of us come from a very specific group of countries in Africa. There's a load of, if you look at basically the undergraduate body and then even the postgraduate body now, Oxford, if you say an Oxford African person, they're likely to either be a Nigerian person or someone from kind of a cluster of countries in Southern Africa, South Africa. We have one Namibian, we have a couple of Zimbabweans. We don't have people in this university in general from the Cameroon, from the French parts of the Cameroons, for example, from the Congo, at least in as many numbers as we do here. So for me, there's still huge divisions in the continent itself based on who you were colonized. I mean, I'm from Nigeria, and Nigerians and Ghanaians argue over who has the better jollof rice, and forget that there are two countries in between them, pretend that they're neighbors. They're not neighbors. There's Togo and there's Benin in between them, but no one cares about Togolese jollof rice or jollof rice from Benin, because they're ex-French colonies. So when we look at the relationship between the diaspora and Africa, questions arise such as, what is the diaspora for Angola? Because Angola's diaspora is not us. Even if you look at Portuguese-speaking non-African majority Black nations, Brazil being a clear example, Brazil has huge racism. I mean, it was the last country in the Americas to abolish slavery. Hey Roger, como está? Tudo bem? He's a Brazilian. But yeah, Brazil has huge racism that has continued, and they've had this ridiculous idea of racial democracy and like similar to the Rainbow Nation idea that's been propagated elsewhere, that everything is kind of fine now and it's moved on. But are people in Angola, in Mozambique, communicating with the people in Brazil, seeing as they share the same language, about their shared struggles, and kind of building this Pan-Africanism which goes beyond the borders only of Africa to start to build people across the diaspora? And are we even reaching out to organize and understand people in other diasporas? Like, do we talk enough with Black French people? Do we know enough about what's going on in France, the movements that are going on in France, the movements that are going in Spain, the movements that are going on in Italy, etc.? That's only in Europe. Or is it kind of like, we're English speaking, we know about what's going on in the US, we know about George Floyd, we know about what's going on here, we know about a bit about the various different English speaking African nations, and we've segregated ourselves in that way. Whereas I'm kind of rambling to get to the point of the question, are Africans indifferent to racism in the diaspora? I feel as though there has always been there's a divide between the diaspora as diaspora, stolen diaspora, i.e. the descendants of slaves, descendants of Windrush, the African Americans, and people on the continent, that is slightly different to those of us who are the children of immigrants directly. So those of us who can trace ourselves and say, like, my parents are from Nigeria, my parents are from here, my parents are from there. And then people who are like, my parents are from Trinidad, and I don't necessarily know where in the continent I'm from because of the fact that my ancestors were taken by force, and that there's been historically some antipathy. So we've got a Trinidadian. I'm just gonna name every nationality of the group, it seems. And there's traditionally been some antipathy in some regards between Africans and those in the diaspora who are not directly can't trace their lineage directly. I know a story about my granddad, who went to America and said that he didn't get along with the African Americans for various reasons, and he was a Nigerian lecturing in America at that time. And so it's very interesting. But I think that the question isn't, I mean, these divisions exist, and I think some Africans would say that they have the right to be in some ways antipathetic, is that a word? Have a kind of apathetic is what I mean, towards some of the struggles that we claim to have in here, because they're dealing with deeper struggles. If you're in Zimbabwe at the moment, dealing with cholera, dealing with all of the, I mean, mass unemployment, dealing with that kind of stuff. If you're in parts of northern Nigeria dealing with famine, and someone comes to you and says, oh, look at how bad we have it in the UK for this reason or that, the rest, I do understand how some people might say, why are we prioritizing? And we do prioritize the struggles of Black people in the West over what's going on at home. And that is a line which has been told to me before, and which I in some ways sympathize with, because if we've seen what's got something like what's going on in Equatorial Guinea, even what goes on in the white settler nations in Southern Africa till today. The rest, none of them get the same kind of global attention that George Floyd got, because of the power of kind of American and Western cultural hegemony. And even Brazil, which is diaspora, but which is a less known and a more developing diaspora nation than the US. Young people are shot like Black people are shot in Brazil at a level which almost puts the US to shame. The amount of horrific stuff which goes on in Brazil, directed at the Afro-Brazilian community there, is doesn't get anywhere near the same global coverage that something like George Floyd would get. And so I do get the idea that Black people in Africa, or Africans, Black Africans, sometimes want to prioritize their own struggles before prioritizing the struggles of diasporians, who often have better material conditions than them, even if they have worse material conditions than the people surrounding them, and get more media coverage in the global news, at least, than what goes on the home continent. But I still would say that in order for the diaspora to be free, and in order for Africa to be free, Africans need to unite. And to tie it back to, I mean, I've spoken a bit too long, I think. So to tie it back to what I said at the beginning.
No, you're just about, Go on.
Yeah, as in, do I have like
you have 30 seconds more? Yeah.
Cool. Tie it back to what I said at the beginning. I think that despite the fact that there is a justification for this apathy, our focus needs to be on building these lines and these communication networks, not just between the continent and the diaspora, which is very key, but also across the diaspora, because we are still divided into the different groups that the colonizers divided us into. French diaspora, English diaspora, Portuguese speaking diaspora, barely communicate, and when we do communicate with the continent, we communicate with those who correspond to our own groupings. And then, of course, even within the UK, we divide ourselves between the African community and the Caribbean community. And if we're going to overcome kind of white supremacy and any other kind of colonial power that is going to come and try and take over the continent, then unity and organization needs to be key moving forward for a kind of Pan-African future. Anyway, that's me.
Okay, thank you very much, Femi, for that. I really appreciate your spatial analysis of relationships between states in Africa. I mean, you said you were rambling. You weren't really rambling. You were actually setting the proper foundation for this discussion, because you didn't even start with racism. You started with the relationships between Africans, which is really, really important. And that is like the standpoint to even leap off to start thinking about this whole idea. Then you went on to talk about the relationships of us with the West and how we actually should relate with each other, and that you historically connected it. So I think that is really a good foundation. I mean, it's really a wonderful foundation for the discussion we're going to be having today. And moving on, we're going to be listening to Kelly. Is Kelly there?
Yes, I am. Can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, we can.
Wonderful. So thank you for inviting me and having me here. I am logging in from the Netherlands. So I would consider myself a member of the African diaspora. I was born and raised in the Netherlands to a Cameroonian family. And when I first heard this proposition, or the motion that this House believes that Africans are indifferent to racism in the diaspora, I understood that there could be two interpretations to this claim. So the first one being Africans who are in the diaspora are indifferent towards racism, or the second one being Africans living on the continent are indifferent towards racism that occurs within the diaspora. I will address both of these claims, but mostly focus on the former. And before going on a bit further, I would just like to address some definitions. The first one being indifference, which pertains to a lack of concern, a lack of sympathy, or a lack of interest, or as Femi was saying, apathy. And the second one being who actually is the diaspora. And I go by the African Union definition, which states that it consists of people of African origin outside of the continent, irrespective of their citizenship, of their nationality, and who are willing to contribute to the development of the continent and building the African Union. So there are different ties towards heritage there, and there's also a real commitment to seeing people of African descent progress. So I don't agree with the claim that, or I don't fully agree with the claim that Africans are indifferent towards racism, whether it's occurring in the diaspora and whether it's the diasporans themselves seeing it or whether it's Africans on the continent. But what I will say, having lived in the Netherlands and the UK and Belgium, and also traveled a bit around Western Europe, is that what I've seen is when people are moving from an African country to Europe, there seems to be a shift in their recognition of how Blackness and how perceived Africanness gains a social significance within the country that they reside in. And oftentimes there can be negative attributes, stereotypical attributes that are incorporated in that, and that can be met with denial. And there's also a lack of knowledge surrounding the history of Africa beyond just a Eurocentric lens. There is a lot of misrepresentation of the African continent and who Africans are and who Black people are. And sometimes, like Black Dutch people, Black Belgians, so on and so forth, internalize those images and those misrepresentations as truth because that is what they have been shown, that is what they have been taught. And unlearning that is a whole process in itself. And that process is crucial to understanding how racism functions, and it's crucial to dismantling racism built upon white supremacy. In terms of responses towards racism in the African diaspora, from Africans on the continent, we've seen it within the past few months with Black Lives Matter. The African Union condemned the killing of George Floyd, and many embassies in the United States, for example, were actually putting out statements. But even before that, just regular activists, for example, in Kenya and in South Africa, were demonstrating when Alton Sterling was killed by the police and when Philando Castile was killed by the police. And then you also see different lines of communication and solidarity, for example, with the Rhodes Must Fall movement that we have at Oxford. And the focus is on the Cecil Rhodes statue, but it's really greater than that. It's about decolonizing knowledge. It's about addressing structural racism. It's about addressing the way education isn't neutral, isn't value-free, and also perpetuates racism within society, and dismantling that didn't just come from Oxford, like out of the blue. No, it started in South Africa. And there's been a lot of solidarity and working together to raise awareness and raise consciousness, so much so that it hasn't just gained national news, but international news as well. And going back to Femi's point, what he was saying about there needs to be greater unity. So in my capacity as working on race relations within a university setting, so I was chair of the University of Bath's Race Equality Network, but then also have done some consultations with the European Union, the Parliament, and their body called RD that works on racism. There isn't a lot of, or I don't think there is sufficient organization between African diaspora groups, whether they are NGOs or not, like more formal groups, in terms of what they want to achieve, and in terms of being connected to resources, and in terms of getting everybody on the same page. And because of all this fragmentation, whether they're organizing on the basis of, let's say, nationality, or whether they're organizing on the basis of ethnic affiliation, there isn't as much progress with policy. Another thing I've seen that has hindered Africans in the diaspora, like addressing racism effectively to like a policy level, is just the lack of resources and not being in the same spaces as decision makers. And then finally, another thing I've seen is there are not sufficient, or there's an insufficient amount of statistics that is available to actually say like, okay, we are facing racism in, let's say, education, we're facing racism perhaps in the healthcare system. In the UK, it's better, but they're outside of the EU now. But in the Netherlands, in France, in Germany, because of these lack of statistics, there's always the burden on African communities to prove that something is happening. And then that is often met with denial. And it's this vicious circle, because when you have activists and people who are in policy making spaces saying, okay, we want to gather statistics so that we can put a program in place or whatever, or address it at the right scale, there's this pushback in saying that, well, no, we don't want to have statistics that incorporates ethnicity, because that links back to World War II. And we don't think that's appropriate, but without statistics, there's no policy. So it's been very frustrating working in these circles, but now with more global activism and interconnectedness, decision makers at policymaking tables are beginning to see that lip service really isn't enough. The final thing I wanted to address was Africans reacting to anti-Black racism in the Gulf states and the Arab world, because usually, from my perspective, there's been a lot of emphasis on what is happening to Africans in white majority spaces. But I'd also like to draw attention to the kafala system, which is very prominent in places like Lebanon, prominent in places like Jordan, Kuwait. And for those who don't know what that is, the kafala system allows migrant workers to work in a country as long as they are sponsored by their employer. And the employee, their residency is tied to their employer. So usually what happens is, it tends to be young women. They get sponsored through an agency to work typically as a maid or a house help with a family in the country that they're working with. But what has been discovered is that there's a lot of abuse that happens. They're often tied into very restringent contracts, and the types of abuse that is faced is like withheld salaries, sexual harassment, poor working conditions. And these workers tend to be from Ethiopia, Nigeria, Ghana, Sierra Leone as well. And recently there was a Nigerian maid, I'm just reading out her name, called Busari Peace Ufioma, who was advertised for $1,000 on a Facebook group called Buy and Sell in Lebanon by a Lebanese national. And it wasn't until a Nigerian blogger found this advertisement, posted it on social media, contacted her embassies, and got the attention of Nigerians back at home, but also in Lebanon, that the scandal was released. And what ended up happening was the Nigerians in the Diaspora Commission, which is a subset of the Foreign Ministry, they had to deal with the abuse, and they had to deal with complaints of abuse, but they were actually able to repatriate 94 Nigerian women back home. And activists both in Gulf states, but also on the African continent, such as Sise Gerada, she's from Ethiopia, Brihanu, she was a former domestic worker. She's been raising awareness through her NGO. So it's this systemic exploitation, which is obviously mixed with being a migrant and also being in some of the lower socioeconomic stratas, where you really see the violent forms of racism manifesting. But I'd also like to add, it's not just limited to one socioeconomic class. and class status doesn't exempt one from racism at all. So those are my opening thoughts.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I mean, Kelly, I mean, you really dug deeper. You brought up new things. The introduction of institutions to the discourse is, I mean, is very, very important. And then also your idea of your opinion about data, the philosophy of data, but not only the philosophy of data, the politics of data itself, and how Africa is always holding the short end of the stick, and how it speaks to the fact that maybe we don't want data because the data signifies truths. And if we have corruption, we have data, then we have truths. And that is the problem we have in Africa, but the Western people weaponize that and don't even support the data itself. That's why most of us who are students or researchers, when we get to Africa, it's always very, very difficult to actually get data because we literally have to mine it. We can't just access it. And so I'm really thankful for that. And the idea of your, how you put attention on the spotlight's inequality. How people think about racism, we think about the UK and America. We don't really think about the Middle East. And I'll come back to that, but basically those are the points that you've made, and even deeper ones. And I think it's moving the discussion forward. So our third speaker.
Yeah, all right. So thank you so much for this opportunity. I think it's always important that as Africans, however we define ourselves, and wherever we are in the world, we participate in conversations that are very constructive in terms of bridging gaps. Because one thing that racism does, which actually plays on the logic or illogic of colonialism, was to sow seeds of discord among Africans. So once we are divided, then certainly we are fighting a losing battle. And so it is important. I think Femi began with an important assumption, the idea of the African diaspora. Now, but I think that before we even talk about the African diaspora, we need to understand how we define ourselves as Africans, because how we define ourselves would go a long way to shaping how we relate with others who are like us or who are not like us elsewhere in the rest of the world. This is precisely because the question of racism seeks to answer the question, or the issue of racism answers the question, how do I like somebody who isn't like me? How do I appreciate difference? That is, so you notice that within the human community, once we have the understanding of us, it means there is the non-us, there is the other who doesn't look like us and who is different from us. Now that in itself isn't bad. But the problem is when, by defining who we are, we place ourselves on a pedestal that is higher than everybody else. That is where the challenge comes in. And now, we know that historically, the notion of Africa itself is an invention. You know, so many scholars have talked about it, including Mudimbe, Valentine Mudimbe, the invention of Africa. That when we say we Africans, when did we have that construction? Was it before colonialism? Was it during colonialism? And was it after colonialism? Because that will then shape how we relate to Africans on the continent and those in the diaspora. Now, as Ali Mazrui makes an important observation in one of his pieces, he said that when we defined ourselves as Africans, we did so in opposition to the European colonizer. Because at that point, we all assumed that we had a common challenge. And that challenge was the suppression and oppression from the colonizer. And so whether we go by the Frans Fanonian notion of violence to overturn the wheels of colonialism, or we got caught up by Satyagraha or positive defiance of Gandhi and Kwame Nkrumah, the whole notion was that we were fighting a common enemy. Now, after the common enemy had left, how do we then bridge gaps? Because over the years, that has been the burden of African unity. Because we seem to have been divided on linguistic lines, unfortunately on racial lines as well, so that even within Africa, we have so-called Sub-Saharan Africa and then Northern Africa. And there seems to be a polarization not just on, or even on a basis of religion or linguistic alone, but also in terms of how we frame our identity, because those in the North see themselves differently from those in the so-called South. And that for me is the challenge. Now, let's address the questions of racism and how people think that Africans on the continent are indifferent to the plight, as it were, of Africans in diaspora. So in this perspective, I'll give a certain background, a certain history to the conversation. So I'm a Ghanaian, and I come from Ghana, West Africa. And having read Pan-Africanism as an African studies student for my first 2 degrees in Ghana, I have come to appreciate the fact that in many cases, who gets to write the story of Africans is very important. You know, because we do know that one of the damaging effects of colonialism, which has lingered for all this while, is what scholars call epistemic injustice. Who is writing about us? Now, this is precisely because for a very long time, we had assumed that Africans on the continent were out of touch with the realities in the diaspora. For example, as late as the earliest 20th century, sometime around 1913 and 1915, there was a Ghanaian chief called Alfred Charles Sam, who was very much involved in Pan-African activities. And he singularly supported and financed the return of Africans in the diaspora back to Africa, specifically to the Gold Coast. Now, beyond that, even before that time, way back in 1471, when the Portuguese registered their presence for the first time in the Gold Coast, now Ghana, we do know that one of the things that happened out of that was miscegenation, where you had Europeans having sexual relationship or sexual congress with African women along the coast. And one of the byproducts of such relationships was the birth of the so-called mulattoes. And so if we recall, we do know that so-called formal or Western education in many parts of Africa started with the mulattoes, as it were. And then there's the idea of civilizing mission, the idea of commerce, the idea of Christianity itself was directed primarily to the mulattoes before later in the 19th centuries it spread to people who were not mulattoes. Now, the question then is, how did many African societies dealt with the issues of mulattoes? How did they integrate people who looked different, even though they had been born on the continent of Africa? Now, in the case of the Gold Coast, which I'm very familiar with, what they did was that they had what we call military groupings, the Asafo Company. And many of these mulattoes were incorporated into the Asafo system so that they will be counted as part of the indigenous people. So right from the word go, you notice that there was that conscious and deliberate effort at incorporating people of African descent, either on the continent or out of the continent, within the rubrics of African society. In 1930s, for example, when Ethiopia was under the
Charles, you have a minute more.
Come again, please.
I'm sorry, you have a minute more, but you can continue.
Right, like when they were under the aggression of Italy, you had people from Africa mobilizing support financially and militarily to go in defense of Ethiopia. So that relationship has always been there. But the reason there appears to be a bit of indifference, as people perceive it, is precisely because racism in the US or in the Western part of the world seeks to assimilate Africans, but not on equal grounds. So Africans had to lose out. They had to lose out on their cultures. And unfortunately, many of them were educated to think of themselves as higher than Africans on the continent. And because of that, that tension has always been there. So if you study most of the civil wars in Liberia, in Sierra Leone, you notice that there was a question of racism, where people of African descent who had been repatriated to Africa felt they were more better placed, better civilized to rule over the indigents. So that tension has always been there.
Right.
So how do we break that tension? That's what we need to
Okay.
discuss. Right. So I'll come in again when the questions are thrown at us. But these are my opening remarks in terms of how we need to understand the relationship between Africans on the continent and those in the diaspora. Of course, if you recall in Ghana, when we had our independence, 1957, Nkrumah Tree invitation to people of African descent. So we have George Padmore, we had W.B. Du Bois, who initially was very skeptical about what to do with Africans in the diaspora, all moving into Ghana to assist in the governmentality of the state, which in effect had a spillover effect to other African countries.
Sorry, Charles, we have to have a lull there, but thank you very much.
Yeah.
That was really some depth. I like the fact that it was your talk was historically thematic, and you picked on the idea of usism, the idea of who the question of who are we as Africans? It's one of the most difficult questions in African history, and it's a question that we always think we've answered already. Almost every historian, every social scientist always thinks that they understand who we are as Africans, who we are Africans, who we are, who are we. But I like the fact that you revealed the complexity of this conundrum, and then you also went down to the philosophy and the politics of epistemology, of how knowledge comes from and how it has affected us as Africans. Also the idea of what I really picked towards the end of your talk, the superiority complex of Africans in the diaspora, how they think they know about Africa just because they are Africans by relationship or in another way. But the idea is not to, the idea, like you said, is not to like split us up. The idea is to create a unity. And the tension and the forces that we need to employ in creating that unity is one of the most complicated things that we still have to think over. So yeah, thank you very much. And with this, we'll bring over our last but not the least speaker before we start opening up to further discussions. So Debbie.
Hi, everyone. So
Hello, Debbie.
Hello?
Hi.
Hello. Yeah.
Okay, sorry. My connection has been a bit unstable. Okay, so I'm really glad that we brought up that issue, the complexity and the contested identity of what it means to be African. I think at the background, this is a very important question that we should be mulling through as we're having this conversation. Basically just coming back to the fact that African identity is not essentialist. It's not bound by geographic boundary or language or perceived ties. I mean, it's dynamic, it's contested, so it is complex. But I think what I really wanted to get across is that African people's perspectives on racism depend very closely on their positionality and the context in which they find themselves. Racism is often present, but it's not always perceptible. So yeah, I mean, essentially the racism that is experienced in post-colonial African countries is a legacy of colonialist ideologies, which utilized racism as a justification for the subjugation of indigenous peoples here. We know that there were efforts to use pseudoscience to pretty much create these classifications and justify basically subjugating Black people or thinking of them as less than human or subhuman, as well as, on the other hand, valorizing all things European and white and Western. We really have to consider how much more subtle that form of racism was within the continent. Basically just leading to our own internalized racism and self-policing. But racism in the diaspora, I'd say, is really its own beast. It's highly contextualized to the particular nation and its histories with slavery, colonialism, and just other forms of racial discrimination. We know that it's systemic and pervasive. But for any African who remains within their national community, in the diaspora, or for someone who has recently moved to a majority I mean, you can't even say necessarily a majority white country, because as Kellyanne noted, this is pervasive in the Arab world, in the East. But essentially, just whenever an African moves into, these, don't have a prior understanding of the historical baggage which Black people who have already settled there have, you can presume to live unaffected until you're blatantly racialized as Black, and whatever that means in that context. So for me, for example, having lived so far in the US, in the UK, in Ireland, and of course in Ghana, where I'm from, I mean, for an African living in Africa, you don't even perceive yourself as Black until you come against something else, right? It's not, this isn't, this idea of what it means to be Black or having negative associations with Blackness is something that comes when you are in relation to another, right? So when you move into a different context, for example, when I was in the States, I remember going in, a lot of us had the idea that, African Americans were just always complaining, like, oh, they want to bring up slavery, something that happened 400 years ago, to justify whatever alleged persecutions they're experiencing here. But the fact was, I couldn't read certain microaggressions. I couldn't read certain interactions as racist because I didn't have an understanding of the historical associations of these words, or these, phrases that people would use, these coded phrases that were basically not so subtly racist. And it took time and an actual investment in learning about the historical baggage that comes with Blackness in that particular context of America that allowed me to kind of read the nuances and understand where to place myself. Because as an African whose ancestors hadn't gone through the same sort of struggle, it's very difficult to now be racialized as, this sort of essentializing object, really, that both Europeans and Americans embarked on during colonialism, during slavery, to make all Black people the same beast, is what we see till today. So, I mean, it's kind of a dicey issue, because you realize that, yes, we do have a common struggle because we are all racialized as Black people. And thus it's assumed we have the same, we're going through the same struggles. We have the same sort of oppression. And yes, at the foundation, racism is kind of the underlying factor across nations. But we do also have to recognize that not all forms of oppression are the same. So decolonization, and thus the tools that you'll use to dismantle it, are not the same as racism, even though they intersect. And I think that, when we consider these things, maybe we'll have a little more understanding of why it seems some Africans are indifferent to racism happening in other countries. I mean, if you don't have the tools to actually perceive what someone is talking about, if you don't have the historical understanding, if you haven't personally experienced something that blatantly tells you that, this person did this because I'm Black, or this happened to me because of my skin color, or because nobody waited to ask me whether I'm from Ghana or Nigeria, but they just saw a Black person and they shot me. I think there's a lot more nuance here than perhaps we like to get into. And on that point, I think historically we've seen that some of the struggles with Black movements, for example, you know, if we're thinking about Leopold Senghor's negritude and Frantz Fanon's critique of it, was that it's relying on the same logic as racism itself, essentializing Black people as the same. And if we're trying to move forward and mobilize, I mean, I think that we first, as Fanon would probably say, have to have an understanding of our own cultures in the wake of whether it's independence or civil rights movements, have a firm understanding of how we are, I guess, nationally or culturally thinking of ourselves as a unit. And then, I guess, on a wider scale, thinking about how we can mobilize and interlink our struggles to...
Sorry, Debbie, you have like 30 seconds more.
Sorry.
Oh, you're done.
Overturn. Yeah, I'm basically done. That's fine. We can move on to questions.
You still have 20 seconds if you want to go a little bit.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think just basically we have to understand that the conversation is a lot more nuanced than we realize. Racism, decolonization, these are different forms of oppression that are intertwined, but that we do need to differentiate between.
Okay. Thanks a lot for that. I mean, you brought up the idea of gradients in the discussion and showing us that it's not just one side and the other side. They're nuances, they're gradients to the whole situation and the whole discourse, and also allowing us to understand that perception is indeed a very difficult problem. The perception itself is a problem. It's not just racism, it's how we see racism itself. And so if somebody from Africa who has a different perception and background hears about racism, it's a bit different. I mean, I know a lot of Nigerians here who saw the Black Lives Matter protest, and they just didn't understand it. And they felt it was just a bunch of angry Black people on the streets because they were ignorant of what these people are actually going through. In Nigeria, I didn't think much of racism till I started going all over the world, and then I experienced it. I mean, from a professor of business calling me a monkey to an angry white person almost pulling a gun up at me. I mean, I started to understand that there are people who exist who actually do not like me just because of the way I look. And that idea of perception, I think, is one of the entry points into actually effectively unpacking what the whole idea of peace is, not just racism, how to even find a way out from the whole thing. So I really like that. And the fact that you said that racism is present but not always perceptible is actually a very strong statement, because it speaks to the fact that some of us don't even understand that it's there. So it's not just the misunderstanding of it, it's the fact that we don't even know that it's there. And yeah, thank you very much for that. I won't try to link the points between all the four speakers, even though I'm so much tempted to do that. I will open up the floor to anybody who wants to ask questions first before contributions. And whoever wants to ask.
Can I respond to Debbie's presentation? Just a quick.
Just hold on, Prempe. I know you really want to respond. There's so many people who want to respond to so many things.
Yeah.
Just hold that thought. We just want to invite the people who are in the audience to actually ask questions if they have questions. And so whoever it is who wants to ask a question.
Yeah, and please feel free.
Julia, you can handle that.
Yeah. So please feel free to either comment send your question in the chat or raise your hand and we'll open up the floor. So if you have any questions for any of the four speakers, I guess just to comment while waiting for the questions to come in, I guess commenting on Debbie's last point, I think you mentioned the idea of sort of reading contextually, sort of contextual reading of and sort of the historically grounded forms of racism that in different spaces. And I think that's something that I think personally that I experienced coming to England and learning to read the contextual race relations, I think, that were ensuing around me between the mainly Afro-Caribbean communities and the white communities that I was around. And I think it does have its own, each environment does have its own unique context as to how the races have negotiated each other. And I think that's how the period of learning happens, sort of when we step outside of our own former spaces of negotiating our identities, our colors with the world around us, to these new environments, which force us to challenge those previous assumptions, basically. So I thought that was really interesting. And I think I'll start with the first question, really, which kind of goes to building on that point from Debbie, was what have been people's first reactions or observations of either themselves or other people who have gone through that transition, i.e. perhaps coming from a particular space in Africa and moving into the diaspora, and then becoming aware that there is a unique culture of racism in that environment, and it's been targeted towards another community. i.e., how have been some of your communities, African communities, observations and sense of solidarity with racism in the diaspora, with the Afro-Caribbean community in the UK and the African American community in the States? Have you found African communities to be seeking solidarity or seeking distance from that as a community? How have you found that? Because so I kind of want to ask that question to our four speakers, and hopefully that will bridge into some questions from our audience.
Okay, so let me come in, because Debbie made a very important point that would, help us address the question you are posing. So Debbie talks about decolonization, racism, and perhaps colonialism. You see, so what strings all these three things together? Now, I would say that, all these will have qualified answers. So we don't have a straightforward answers to the issues she raised. But the point is this. Now, racism was developed, and as she rightly said, on a pseudo-science basis to rationalize. So the question is, why should we do what we want to do? What should support us? What should provide the philosophical perspective and support for us to be able to subjugate another group of people? So that whether it is Immanuel Kant writing in the 17th century, whether it is Blumenberg in Germany trying to develop some racial theories, or whether it is some people deploying the story of Noah in the Bible, right? The whole agenda was to be able to justify why others should be subjugated, So the response to racism was very complex and holistic. So on the one hand, it had a subterfuge which flowed into education, into the political system and arrangement that we inherited. It flowed into even religion that we practice, all right? So it had a very totalizing presence in every sphere of life as far as the African is concerned. So the center of it is what I would call deculturalization, making you look down on your own culture. So you are stripped of your culture. You suffer what Orlando Patterson will call social death. Now, when you suffer that kind of social death, and you move out of Africa to the rest of the world, where there's huge Black population who may not directly come from Africa, there is a way you tend to see them, because culturally, there are differences. So that so-called phenotype-wise, you might think you are the same. But in terms of how the cultural orientations have shaped your perspective and your thinking, what becomes obvious is that you see clear difference. And that difference, based on a certain level of cultural orientations, tend to polarized. Okay, it gets us fragmented. So that when I see a Jamaican, I see a Jamaican differently from the way I would see a Ghanaian or I would see a Nigerian in the UK. So basically, when we want to reverse, which is almost an anthill task, what we need to do is to understand the foundational basis of racism. Because now almost everybody is not talking about biological factors or phenotype. Now it's a question of culture, right? You recall that in 2007, when James Watson said Africans are genetically inferior-minded people, he was attacked. So the question is, there's a certain level of, oh, it's not racism because that is not scientific. It is not cultural. So they say, oh, their culture is backward. But they are getting back to the same thing, the same debate. So when we meet Africans in the diaspora, I think the first thing we need to do is to appreciate difference.
Yeah.
And difference not in terms of ignoring what is not like you or homogenizing everything, but difference in a sense that let's identify with our common challenges. I think that for me is a very strong position. That will be a very strong
okay. Yeah. No. Thank you, Charles. I'll come back to that quickly. I have a question from a YouTube viewer that I think I'll share with you in a moment. But I'll begin with a question. We have a Gerald Dahin. We have your hand up. I'm going to unmute you, and please share your question. Hold on, this is coming through.
Yeah, hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Right, super. So my question really is in relation to Charles's first presentation with regards to racism on the continent, where he made the point that when during slavery, the whites had this sexual relations with blacks and gave birth to what we call quote unquote mulattoes, and as a result were better placed in terms of education and saw themselves to be those who should take the affairs of governance. So with this, so I've lived in Ghana for almost all my life, but since last year, it appears that even socially on an individual level, there are instances where people on the continent even believe that the color of one's skin places one at a better advantage to the other. So if you are the more lighter skinned you are, the more you are appreciated, of course, which you see lots of Africans, black people, trying to even bleach themselves and all of those. So having that in mind, I want to ask that, is it that this form of color appreciation can also be attributed to colonial rules, sort of such that the people even believe themselves that the more lighter you are, the more appreciated you should be? And in fact, in Ghana, for instance, and some African countries that I've visited, if people are having qualms, two people are having qualms, and one is fair-skinned and the other is darker skinned, the likelihood of the darker skin, the darker you are being used as an insult is very higher, saying that look at how black you are. The person will never say, look at how fair you are. And this is between two Africans. So I want to find out whether that can also be attributed to colonial rule or is just a social fact.
Yeah. And thank you for that, Gerald. We're going to receive 2 more questions, and we're going to just then ask our speakers to respond to them. So Charles, you make a note of that question. We'll come back to that. I will open up the mic to Masado. I'll unmute you now.
Hi, thank you so much for letting me speak. I'm Masando. I'm from Cameroon. I'm from the Francophone part of Cameroon, but I've been Anglophone my entire life. I'm really glad to be part of this conversation. What I really appreciate all the speakers' comments, and something that I gathered from everyone was the way that we frame Africanism and the way that we frame the diaspora, and how that plays into the conversation of what racism is and who feels implicated in the issue of racism. There were great points about lines of divisions across language, lines of divisions across, the Sahara. That changes the way that people see themselves. And Debbie brought a really good point about Blackness and how we define Blackness. And I think that one of the things that I think about when thinking about proposition and why, or if Africans are indifferent to racism around diaspora, I think a lot of that has to do with the way that we frame racism and how we essentialize Blackness, but how within the conversation of racism, we immediately go to Blackness versus whiteness. And I love that Kellyanne brought in the Gulf states and how racism plays out in the Gulf states, because we tend to forget that racism exists outside of the West and implicates people beyond Black people. And I think that if we're going to talk about Africa, then we need to be talking about beyond just Blackness, because we have those northern countries that are also that. We need to talk about Islamophobia as well and how that plays into it all. And I really wanted to ask all of you how we take that step into reframing the conversation about racism so that we can start acknowledging, the entire world, greater parts of the diaspora, but also reconciling our various African identities and talking about ethnicity, race, but also gender and religion.
Okay. Thank you for that quick question. Moving on. Sorry to cut you off, Stephen. Take one more question from Uchechukwu. I'm going to just ask you to unmute you now.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Okay, good evening, everyone. I believe that it's already evening where you are. So mine is not a question. Mine is just a quick contribution. And I would like to, first of all, appreciate those who organized this program. This is a wonderful platform for young Africans to actually rub minds. I want to contribute that if the question we are trying to answer this wonderful afternoon is a question of what makes Africans, especially continental Africans, to appear insensitive to the issues of racism in the diaspora, I think we need to narrow it down to the challenge of those issues happening back home. Lots of these young Africans are more preoccupied with reacting to the issues that are happening back home, that they find it a little difficult to engage some of those issues that happen in the diaspora. I give you a typical example. Earlier in the year, George Floyd was killed. At the same time that George Floyd was killed, in Nigeria, where I come from, I'm Nigerian, at the same time, we had an issue where our National Assembly had just approved the borrowing of the sum of $27.2 billion. Part of the countries where we have to borrow this money from was the US. And the same National Assembly approved the use of 29 billion naira for the renovation of the National Assembly. We were also supposed to borrow from the United Kingdom. When David Cameron renovated Downing Street, he used a total of 550 million naira to do that, the naira equivalent of that. When Donald Trump renovated the White House 3 years ago in 2017, he used $1.7 million, which is the current naira equivalent of nearly $1 billion to do it. But we were planning to use 27 billion naira to renovate our National Assembly. At about the same time, in a small state in Nigeria, well, a very big state anyway, called Kaduna, over 200...
Sorry, you have like a minute more.
Hello?
No, just continue. I'm just saying that you have like a minute more because we want to wrap up a lot of questions. Yeah, continue.
Over 200 people were killed in cold blood. So you discover that it becomes a little challenging for me as a young Nigerian living in the United States to abandon some of those issues and be preoccupied with the challenge of Black Lives Matter in the US. Secondly, Black Lives Matter, quickly, it did not start in 2020. It started in 2013. Recall that when it started in my country called Nigeria, at that time, Nigeria refused to pass the LGBTQ law. In fact, we criminalized gay marriage. At the same time, Boko Haram was gaining momentum in Nigeria. Nigeria tried to buy arms from the United States government under Barack Obama. The United States government shut her doors to Nigeria because we did not legalize gay marriage. Nigeria went to Israel to buy arms. Barack Obama threatened Israel that they would sever diplomatic ties with them if they sold arms to Nigeria. At about the same time, recall that between 2013 and now, tens of thousands of Nigerians have been killed in cold blood by Boko Haram because they have gathered momentum significantly between those years. So you discover that when we come out to the diaspora, we are left with lots of questions that are unanswered. And as much as we try to also assume that some of these questions do not exist, they contribute to the inherent lethargic response that you get from continental Africans in the diaspora when issues that concern Blacks in the diaspora is concerned. And let me say that we also believe, especially those of us who are young Africans from continental Africa, we also believe that the value of a Black life killed in continental Africa should be attributed the same value as the life killed in the diaspora. We shouldn't go haywire, lose our lives, lose our heads, because George Floyd was killed in America, whereas it seems as if even the Black diaspora, especially those who are not continental Africans, seem insensitive, as it were, as typified by what Barack Obama did in 2013 to the biggest Black nation in the world, Nigeria, by turning blind eyes to it when these lives are lost in continental Africa. Thank you very much.
Interesting. Yeah. So, so back to the panel. I think we'll start off with Charles. If we can try and keep this short and succinct, that will be really much appreciated.
All right. So I'll go to Gerard and then pass the rest to my other panelists to respond to. Okay. So the idea of Black and white. Now, let me answer in this way. So first and foremost, the construction of Black as evil and white as good and beautiful itself fits into a certain philosophy, what we call aesthetics, right? So the Europeans came and borrowed from the Greek philosophy that beauty lies in the eyes of the beholder. So you are not beautiful until someone tells you you are beautiful. That's basically what it implies. So there's no inherent beauty. And so the Europeans succeeded in implanting in us to see the color Black as evil and the color white as good and well and sound. And beyond that, that was also incorporated into the education system, where people then identified anything good with white, anything bad with Black. So Black lie. In anything that is bad is Black, Black, Black. Anything that is good is white lies, which is not too bad a lie, but it's constructive lie for a constructive purpose. So we framed all these based on the kinds of assumptions that we inherited from the colonial system. And as I said, when we talk about colonialism, we only think of the physical presence of the Europeans. No, it fed into the education system. It fed into religion. It fed into politics, so that it fed into language. All right. So it is systemic and it's structural. Right. And that is why fighting it is not just physical. It would take some kind of deliberate and intentionality to reverse by reforming the education system. Because as we speak, Jesus is white, the devil is Black. Adam is white, whoever did wrong is Black. Until we're able to look at our education system and reform it, it will be evil for us. For example, Gerard was talking about Ghana. Quick one. So Ghana, when somebody is happy with a child, so my white child, me brony. All right, even if the child is Black, that's the person who say. So there's a way we've read aesthetic into whiteness as being good and Black as evil. And precisely that is what racism did to us.
Thank you for that, Charles. The rest of our panelists, Kelly, Deborah, do you have any comments to that statement or to the questions shared by Masado? And
I have some comments.
Yeah, I have some comments too. Femi, you can go first if you like.
All right, cool. So yeah, I think when the stuff about Islamophobia and also racism within the continent and outside of the continent. I think within the Nigerian example, yes, if you look, someone was saying that as a Nigerian coming to the Western world, they didn't really understand someone not having an apathy towards them because of the color of their skin or how they looked. And that's understandable in a way, because in Nigeria we have a lot of tribalism, we have a lot of this, but it's more based upon ethnicity rather than race. If you go across, and people were mentioning North African states to east, you can look at, for example, Sudan. And in Sudan, you have very, very different phenotypes between South Sudan and North Sudan. What is now South Sudan and North Sudan, both of them used to be the same state before the civil war and the secession. And South Sudanese people are very, very, very tall, very, very, very dark, have a very distinctive feature. And Northern Sudanian people are lighter. And although they don't present as Arabs, some of them like to think.
Femi, we lost you on the microphone.
Okay, he's back.
Yeah.
Sorry,
Kelly, do you want to? Oh.
My mum tried to call me just as I was speaking. They have slightly wavier hair, etc. And so we do have within the continent differences which can be presented as more than solely ethnic, like very, very different distinctive features. And that experience can happen within the continent, and then also the various colorisms which happen outside of the continent and within. So it's not a clear kind of black and white picture.
Okay.
But yeah, I think I won't remember too much.
Okay, right. Kelly.
Okay, Kelly. Hey, Kelly, yeah, do you want to share your thoughts on that?
Yeah, just moving on to Gerald's question about the preference towards lighter skin that he saw in Ghana, or he was aware of in Ghana. It's definitely not limited to there. In fact, if we look at Latin America, more specifically in Brazil, there was actually a policy, and forgive my pronunciation, but it was blanqueamiento. And it was a policy of intentional racial, a policy of intentional racial whitening, whereby the state made it easier for European immigrants to come into Brazil to settle there. And they were basically encouraged to mate and have sexual relations with the people of African descent who tended to be enslaved, and then with the hopes that the population would become more white over the generations. So you see it in Africa on the continent, but you also see it within diaspora communities. And you see it in Europe as well, with this preference for lighter skin being associated with beauty, but sometimes with women, it's like you want to be bronze or tan, but then not too tan. But that's a different conversation for a different day. So yes, colorism definitely is a thing, and it's not just limited to Africa. On to Masado's question about reframing the conversation about racism. I think here, what is key is intersectionality and understanding the way that class and gender, also thinking about different aspects of positionality will influence the way that racism manifests wherever you are in the world. Charles was talking about how racism is no longer, or tends not to be, rooted in biology now. That's not in fashion. That's something that is condemned a lot more strongly. But what we see now more often is racism that's based in this essentialized, unchanging view of culture or perception of culture. And this is something that is extremely pertinent in the Netherlands. I did my thesis on this thing called colorblind racism, whereby the concept of race that is attributed to biological differences, that's really, it's the most horrible thing, and it's recognized as something that's very horrible because of the Netherlands' past with the Holocaust. But the way that racism does manifest itself is inequalities within society, is negligence towards systemic lower quality of life that people of color face. And it is often attributed to like, oh, this Black community, because of their culture and their unwillingness to assimilate into truly Dutch culture, that is why they're not doing as well. That is why they don't live in certain neighborhoods. That is why police profiling is happening more to them. So you see it moving from basically from biology to culture. Yeah. And simultaneously, and here's the paradox, people will have the nerve to say, I don't see color. So now I think with greater awareness about how racism manifests, it's just too uncomfortable and it's too blatant to deny. But that denial and that minimization, very common in the Netherlands, and I can say in France too, where there's a real aversion to acknowledging color, and thereby using that as an excuse not to acknowledge racism. That argument just doesn't hold. But people will emotionally hold on.
Yeah, no, thank you. No, thanks so much, Kelly. I know we're obviously running short of time. I hope people won't mind if we go 5 to 10 minutes over. I do understand if people have to leave at 4 sharp. But I quickly want to bring in Junie James, who is a founding member and director of an organization called ACI, African, Caribbean, and African Cultural Heritage Initiative in Oxford. Junie's Jamaican-born, a Jamaican-born activist who obviously resides in Oxford now. And I wanted to bring it in to share her thoughts on how, being that conversation begins from an Oxford-Cambridge sort of geographical landscape, her perspectives on how Africans have related with the Afro-Caribbean experience in Oxford, and from her perceptions over what must have been obviously several years. So I just want to bring Jenny on the floor right now. Hi, Jenny. Hi, Jenny. I think you're muted. Sorry. Let me just make sure you're unmuted.
Okay. Good afternoon, and thanks for inviting me. Interesting and insightful discussion. Yes, you want my views and opinions, but before I do that, I have to express my personal opinions about the use of the term Africans. I personally have a difficulty with it because you have the differences between continental Africans and diasporan Africans. And as a people, we have this tendency not to identify with Africa. I grew up in the 60s in England, and being African was seen as a very negative thing to be, because all you saw were images of disarray, disorganized, disunity, wars, famine, all the negative things that you could possibly think of were constantly being fed to us by the media. So a lot of diasporans didn't want to associate with Africa because Africa was too negative for them to be Africans. I've grown up being an African person, even though we're growing up in Jamaica for the first many years of my life. I witnessed racism there as much as I witnessed racism when I came to Britain. It was blatant in UK, more subtle in Jamaica, because the white man controlled everything. So for me, the idea of encountering Africans from the continent who often say, I've never experienced racism, I usually cringe, because I think, how can you not have experienced racism when you live in a nation that's dominated by Europeans, white Europeans, who control everything, every aspect of your life, despite independence? Ghana received theirs first in 1957, Nigeria in 1960. That's not many years ago, you know, so we can actually look back and think, okay, that's what happened. But even today, the Europeans still influence policies, politics, economics, social and cultural mores in all of Africa and the diaspora. Jamaica is no different. Whether it's from America or from Europe, their influence is very strong.
And Junie, sorry to cut you off there. How did you find Africans coming to Oxford? How did you find their awareness of issues happening in Britain and the Afro-Caribbean experience in the UK? Did you find them cognitively aware, empathetic, or indifferent? How did you find that over the years?
Very indifferent. I have to say that when, as a Caribbean person, we're often told that we focus too much on racism rather than just getting on with life. And the Africans that I encountered in my early years were largely here a student population. They didn't interact very much with the Caribbean community. And when they do, the very few that lived in the community were very actively involved in the race, what was then the race relations movement, became race equality movement. So they were influential in the policy changes that took place in Britain, the legislation that took place in Britain. So they were actively involved, but the student population were very indifferent. They were there as academics. They were not integrating at all and had very little contact with the general Black population in Oxford. So that's my experience. And over the years, I have seen some changes, but not sufficient changes. And there is this difference between the continent and the diaspora. And as been said, the notion that when Africans from the continent come to the diaspora, their focus and emphasis is very different to that of the diasporans living in Europe or America or elsewhere, because the difference is they come with a particular objective, get an education and leave. Those of us who are here, we are here, and our intention is to stay as long as we can, or until we achieve the financial stability to be able to leave Britain in particular, and America also. Most Caribbeans who go to these parts of Europe do not go there with a permanent intention of remaining there.
Yeah, no, thank you, Julie. I will, obviously, as I said, we have 3 minutes left to our original time schedule, but I do want to take this over by 5 or 10 minutes. So I have got a question from Nomaka that I'm going to take now, and a question that's come in the chat, which is there's a few here, which asks the question: isn't this, aren't we at the bottom of this always negotiating the question of tribalism? That is an inherent affinity with a particular group or community of people because of various signifiers that we attach as being part of that collective tribe. Are we not? So that's a question from Nomaka and a question from the chat, which is just challenging us to think about the reality of tribalism. Nomaka, do you want to unmute yourself and speak?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I think I asked my question earlier, so I think a lot of the speakers have commented on what I was asking, but I just want to make a quick contribution with regards to the, what we define as in difference from people coming in from the continent here. I think I'd like to see it as, I think that for many people that come like directly from Nigeria or Ghana, where these are like Black majority societies, I feel like there's a period of racial awakening, because it's almost a culture shock. If you grow up in Lagos, for instance, nobody refers to you as Black. So categories like when you come here and people refer to you as a person of color or a BAME student is really, really weird, because that's not how you grew up and you have never conceptualized yourself in those identities. So it takes a while for you to become very familiar. And I think a lot of it is conscious learning about the politics and history of Blackness in other parts of the world. And I think that Africans from perhaps from like Southern Africa, where they had white minority people rule for a while, I think they are better able to relate to these experiences because they had direct, experiences of being discriminated on basis of their skin color, as opposed to in Nigeria, for instance, is in terms of tribalism and religion, and perhaps the elevation of representations of whiteness. So if you have a British or American accent, or you have a foreign education. But in terms of being discriminated on basis of your skin color, it's usually a very, when I talk to a lot of people that have come here for the first time, it's weird, and it takes a while for them to understand the peculiar politics of Blackness outside of where they're coming from. So I'd like to see it less as indifferent, but as something that takes quite a time for people to understand and become familiar with. And honestly, at least personally, you need to commit yourself to learning about how, regardless of how we're all ultimately connected, whether you're in the continent or you're in the diaspora, or whether you're from the Caribbean or wherever. So yeah.
And to thank you for that, Mamaka. I think that was really a great way of coming close to sort of bringing the conversation to a natural. And I think with some of those points you mentioned and the cue on tribalism, Debbie, I would love to hear your thoughts on some of the points Mamaka mentioned there, Junie, and the notion of pre-existing tribalism, sense of tribalism within the African communities. And but within I would like to just pose those questions to you, Debbie, and hear your thoughts on those.
Thank you. So I mean, these were really, really useful observations that were brought up by Junie. And sorry, I didn't catch the name of the last. Nwamaka.
Yeah.
I mean, as I was saying earlier, I've had different experiences in different places. And just as Nwamaka said, I mean, it does take deliberate learning and unlearning, really, and considering one's own positionality and biases, inherent or overt, to really understand where other people are coming from, the experiences that they have gone through historically. I think that for some, that day really never comes. I've had very heated conversations during the past few months with fellow Ghanaians who have never traveled out and who think that based on, you know, some surface level reading of the situation, you know, that Black people are basically blowing things out of proportion when they talk about racial issues in various contexts. Or, I mean, it really, I don't like to think that it's intentional. I think that it really is just a function of the fact that our own experience of racism hasn't been as overt, I think, as in other situations. So with Ghana, for example, we know what the British did, right? It was a very strategic move to use indirect rule within Ghana, rather than something more overt like apartheid in South Africa. Really just using education, for example, to help us unlearn our own culture, to elevate whiteness and European attributes to basically a level of excellence. When we think about all of these things, it's very hard for people to unlearn something that they don't even realize has happened, right? If in casual conversation, I mean, I laugh with one of my friends when we're copying how people talk about white people here. It's like, oh, you know, the white man has been so wise to think up, you know, this telecommunication equipment. You know, like it's almost an unconscious thing where we're just like, oh, you know, everything excellent, everything innovative is associated with Europe or the West, or the East right now with China. Progress, development, the way we frame these things, for ourselves has set us back. So if we're going into a context where we already have at the back of our minds that, you know, these Europeans or these Americans know how to do things the right way, you know, these are our examples. If you're going into a place blind and you don't have an understanding of the ingrained racial hierarchies, you will really just float along and mind your own business for a while until you have probably a very blatant experience of racism, and that usually wakes you up. I mean, for me, it was, you know, as a very young child, I grew up in the States. And thinking back, it's only now reflecting on some of my experiences as a child that I can even remember, you know, some things that I would have, you know, not really thought much of. Even having African Americans say, call me Black, you know, and me wondering what they meant by that, but then saying, oh, you know, you're much Blacker than we, you know, than we are. Or do you pet, you know, do you have pet tigers and lions? I mean, there's ignorance on both sides. Yeah. And I think that it's these times that force us to confront the realities of racism in different parts of the world and force us to learn. So I think that's what's been encouraging about this this time with the BLM protests worldwide, and just the influx of information that's allowing people to, who otherwise would not have had any tangible experiences with race or racism, to actually learn what's happening in other places. So. Yeah,
I like the notion of ignorance elsewhere, but unconscious consumption of internalizing a sort of self-policing at the same time. So that's very interesting sort of, so I want to go to solutions and obviously closing statements. So we are always trying to work towards applicable solutions to the conversations that we bring up here, and to obviously all of our challenges as Africans and Africans in the diaspora. And so I want to sort of hear everyone's thoughts. Start off with Kelly. What do solutions look like for you dealing with sort of that particular landscape in the Netherlands and going forward?
Yeah, thanks. So in the context of the Netherlands, I think solutions are about public awareness, public engagement, and education. If you look at Dutch history textbooks, they will praise the Dutch East India companies, they will praise colonial ventures, they call it the golden age, it's celebrated in arts, but then the suffering and the enslavement that happened, that provided the capital to enrich the Kingdom of the Netherlands, that part of the narrative is often completely erased, completely minimized, and people are unaware. Even within public consciousness, a lot of Dutch people don't associate the Dutch word apartheid with, that is in South Africa, with Dutch, but it is literally of that language. So what I've seen is that there needs to be a certain level of conscious raising within the general population in order for anything productive to happen. The second thing, I believe in statistics, but it has to be done with sensitivity, it has to be done with caution. And I believe that in order to make any progress in terms of overcoming racism, it cannot just be the people who are facing racism who are doing all of the work. It has to be collaborative, because you can adjust yourself as a person who is a minority all you want, but if you do not feel empowered, if there are certain decisions that you cannot make at a structural level because you are not represented, then those who actually are in those positions need to share power in some way or some form. And yeah, just to close off, what has already been mentioned multiple times on the call is a greater awareness of self, because without that, you will be looking at the images presented, which predominantly are either limiting, stereotypical, or just a misrepresentation of who we are as people of African descent.
Thank you, Kelly. And Charles, like on that, and obviously with closing statements, how would you, what is your solution as to the different, how should we define ourselves as self, and to pick a cue from Debbie is, but avoiding the essentialism of how Fanon critiques a negritude. So how do we journey towards the genuine definition of self, but avoiding essentialism of our identity at the same time?
I mean, thank you so much for this. Debbie's comment is very important and spot on. The answer is not easy to produce, you see, because as human as we are, with egocentrism and self-centeredness, it becomes very difficult to be selfless, to appreciate others. And given the world of competition, not complementarity, you notice that people will always come up with ideologies, philosophies, just to suppress others. But whether negritude, pride in African culture, whether emotion, rationalism, or whatever we want to define it, I will go for conscientism of Kwame Nkrumah. Now, Nkrumah introduced the philosophy of conscientism, and that was based on the lived realities of the African continent. And what are the lived realities? One, we have Islam. Two, we have Christianity. We have indigenous belief systems. Now, these are all realities, and they feed into ethnicity, as Mwaka was talking about. It feeds into religion, it feeds into politics and all that. So what do we need to do? Complementarity. We need to appreciate and accept difference, and then learn from one another. I think that for me is the way to go. Now, in terms of education, we need to unlearn to learn. In other words, we need to reconcept. I have always said that we can't deface history. You know, what has happened, but we can reinterpret history. And that is what we need to do. We need to reinterpret history. Let us not try to forget our past, because we are bound to repeat the mistakes. But let us look at the past and reconstruct it in ways that are productive to the challenges of the world today. No matter what happens, the West will be the West. Africa will be Africa, however we define these two spheres. We need to build ourselves. Now, that said, we also need qualitative demography. You know, so you can be in the minority, but you'll be qualitatively stronger than the quantitative demography. So if you look at, for example, during the apartheid in South Africa, whereas the whites were the minority, they ruled the majority. You see, so they took advantage of education, technology to advance themselves and to exert themselves over others. Look at a country like Israel. Population-wise, they are very tiny. Obviously, they get support from the rest of the world, but you could see that there's deliberate effort to make themselves better. So that's what, as Africans, we need to do. Those of us in the diaspora, let's help one another. Let's educate our people. Let our people receive the kind of education that will create a level of consciousness and awareness, you know, not to compete, but to complement with the rest of the world. So that is what I would say. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Charles. That was yeah, that was a really poignant statement there, and I think we'll move on to Femi. And I think taking that forward, Femi, and obviously sharing your closing statements as someone who has a very rich global perspective of and deep historical understanding in so many different contexts. What does the solution look like in terms of the development of this consciousness, which is non-essential, is inward looking, but is also outward looking too? What are your thoughts and closing statements, Femi?
So going back to what our brother from Nigeria was saying earlier, about he finds it difficult to empathize if people are not empathizing with him. As people in the diaspora, what we can do if we want people on the continent to start taking us a bit more seriously is thinking more about what's going on there, and looking more seriously into that, and not just seeing us as ourselves as Black, British, or this, like the rest, or African American, but seeing as ourselves as part of something wider, and then building those connections. I mean, I'm working on a film at the moment, and it's in West Africa, in Niger, and people asking me, why are you going to a French-speaking country to do a film about French colonialism? I'm not British. And my response is, look, the southern border of Niger, which is the line we're traveling, is the northern border of which country? Nigeria. All of these things are interlinked. All of these things are part of yes, we created ourselves as Africans in response to the invasion of someone else, in response to the other coming, but we are now part of that. If we look at post-colonial Africa, there's only been 2 or 3 cases where countries have been allowed to, or for some reason or they have seceded: Ethiopia and Eritrea, Sudan and South Sudan. We still have, by and large, overwhelmingly, the borders that we had at the end of the colonial period, and Africa as an entity is still very much, in many ways, divided in the ways that the Europeans divided us. And I think that the key thing in order for us to be able to make progress is starting to build those connections, organize, draw those links, learn both indigenous languages and sadly also the languages of the colonizers, because someone in Togo is not going to speak to someone in Senegal in Wolof, but they will speak to someone in Senegal in French. And if you want to be able to speak to someone from Togo and someone from Senegal, learning French, learning Portuguese, not so much learning Spanish, because that only really helps, but still learning, but it could still help in if you want to be reaching out to Afro-Latino communities across South America, right? I think making these bridges across the various things which divide us is key. And also, if we want people on the continent to take our struggle seriously in the diaspora, we need to reciprocate.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I will just share my final thoughts and then I'll pass it on to Stephen and I totally agree. I think just to sort of move with the conversation, I agree with Femi. I think as a language undergrad student, French and Spanish with Italian first year, and at the time, so I was born but raised two-thirds of my life in the UK. And certain languages, I think, despite the fact that they were European languages, exposed me to conversations outside the Anglophone speaking world that I don't think I'd have inherently been exposed to if I had taken an entirely Anglophone academic route. Being from a former British colony in Zimbabwe. So, and I think the awareness of Equatorial Guinea, where they speak Spanish, the awareness of some awareness of what a part of Cameroon may have gone through, or a part of Mali or Senegal, or me on a personal note, the Francophone Caribbean, Guadeloupe, Réunion, Martinique, and through Spanish too, thinking about Criollo in Palenque in Colombia, and a lot of the conversations there. I think it coming back from that as my initial starting point about thinking about race outside of my own experiences was something that I would think is an important solution for a lot of us, which connects very well with some of the comments I added before about being aware and sort of self-education, being aware that the divisions that were made between us were not only didn't only exist naturally, perhaps through tribalisms and geography, but they were reinforced and used against us as part of sort of the divisions of Africa. And the fact that you can have two countries side by side who are colonized by different European states and have had different experiences and do not know each other's experiences, past and present, and have that extra hurdle of language is something that we've got to negotiate. It is a genuine barrier between people being able to connect with each other, and that barrier is one of the barriers that I think fragments what collective sense of self should look like outward and inward looking in Africa. So I think I would, like Femi, I fervently promote stepping outside your former colonial sort of like linguistic and sort of semiotic world and engaging with issues elsewhere and returning back and seeing how that will make you think about issues in your.
You can learn Swahili too.
Yeah, Swahili on the way too. That is true. So I waffle there, Stephen. Do you want to share any closing statements from yourself? I think you might be muted there. Stephen. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, it's been very, very multifaceted today, and we've had a variety of different opinions that obviously overlap at multiple points. So I think we've done a lot of work today on really looking at racism. I will just highlight the points of solution that most of the speakers and even people who are putting up opinions in the chat feed are actually coming to in terms of the confluence. And I see them as like 5 basic points. The first one is education. We have to understand that education is political, and we have to understand that we have to educate ourselves, because the current discourse we have as the whole world right now, education is sort of a shield and also a weapon. So it's something that we need to be able to protect ourselves, because through education, we can change perception, which brings me to the second point, the recalibration of perception. And we can only recalibrate perception, the perception of people in Africa and people outside Africa, if we understand language. And I'm not saying language is a means of communication. I'm saying language as in itself a means of identity, a means of culture. Just like Charles said, it's no longer biology, now it's culture. Language is actually a cradle of culture. That is how we know about other people's culture. It's one of the ways that we know about other people's culture. So I think language is also a very important thing. The other important thing that Kelly mentioned that I really, really agree with is data. Data, the politics of data itself, the nature of data and how we actually treat data is very important. I mean, I keep telling people, I said, if you show me the kind of data you have in your country, I can tell you the type of corruption, or if you have corruption in your country in the first place, because data reveals the truth. And when you have the truth, it stands out, and that becomes a problem. So data will help in building intellectual structures. Data will help in building economic structures. Data will definitely, if you build those structures, then definitely it's going to be very easy to build political structures as well. So data is very important. The understanding of it, and the fact that, because sometimes I'm currently studying violence-based conflict in Africa right now, and it's sad that most of the literature you come across are literature of Western people who try to talk about conflict in Africa, and the theories that you have are theories. Most of them are theories from Western people. I am not trying to be racist, but these people speak from a standpoint of very limited experience and very limited knowledge that they deliberately not actually try to get, and that's where you have a problem. And the last point is a delicate measure of Pan-Africanism. I use the word delicate because if you just say Pan-Africanism generally, there's so many gray areas in Pan-Africanism that can be counterproductive if it's not really handled well. So Pan-Africanism in the sense that we really need to come together, but we have to come together the right way. And we shouldn't let other people bring us together. We have to bring ourselves together, because that's the only genuine way of coming together. And so, in this light, understanding that racism is there, and understanding why people think about racism the way they think about racism is also very important. Because if there's anything we've learned today, is that different Africans think about racism in different ways, and they're sort of justified if you actually narrow down ethnographically into their own kind of experience. But the most important thing is the counterproduction of that variety, that motley nature of how we see racism. So we really need to have a sophisticated construction and a unified knowledge of what racism is and how it's affecting us. And most importantly, we have to put these points that you have all come to put forward today into action. How we're going to, thanks everyone.
Exactly. So I think I totally agree. I think on a point there, education is, looking back on some of the conversations there, I reflect and realize that growing up in Zimbabwe, I wonder if I had gone through the entire system up until 18, whether I would have been educated in a history class on the struggle in Guadeloupe, in Colombia, in Mali, in Guinea, in Burundi. And it reminds you that also within African landscape, there are so many opportunities that are being missed, in which we're not being educated about what's happening across geographies, and those are the things that when some of us want to move into positions of power and change, those are areas in which we need to value too what content we are consuming in our classrooms in the UK and in America and everywhere else, wherever we are, the Netherlands, but also what content are we consuming about other Black countries, other African rooted identities and cultures, in the diaspora. Are we being educated about those too? And how valuable would that be in terms of fostering a consciousness about ourselves all over the place? So Yeah, I want to thank you so much for having us today. I want to also give a major shout out to the next discussion in the series. This house believes the new colonialism is information technology. So that's, this house believes the new colonialism is information technology. So that'll be Wednesday, 6 to 7:30 p.m. Please, if you haven't already, follow and follow follow Africa_Oxbridge on Instagram. We're on Facebook too. This is obviously first foray into this collaboration between the two institutions, students and alumni, and we hope to sort of take this forward, and we hope you all to be involved in that. So thank you very much. Thank you to all our speakers. And yeah, keep the conversation going, and please do attend the conversation on Wednesday, 6 to 7:30 p.m. Africa Oxbridge. Thank you so much, guys.
Thank you for having me. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
See you guys.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.